Hello, I'm Elizabeth Puranam and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Germany is re-engaging with China on trade despite the EU flexing its muscles with Beijing. So why can't Berlin break up with the Asian giant? And from free fall to rebound in Nigeria, the Naira rallies after economic reforms, but Nigerians are bearing the brunt of sky-high inflation. The world is nowhere near achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We speak to the President of the UN General Assembly about his call to action. China is Germany's biggest trade partner, but Berlin also sees Beijing as a competitor and a rival. And in its first ever strategy on China, launched last year, it pledged to reduce dependence on the Chinese market. But during his visit last week to China, the German Chancellor signalled his intentions to maintain business ties. That may have angered some of Olaf Scholz's closest allies. The EU has launched several investigations into exports of Chinese green technology to protect European industry from what it sees as unfair competition. Dmitry Medvedenko reports on what's at stake for Scholz.
3 days in China for Chancellor Olaf Scholz and his entourage of top chief executives from leading German companies. That's despite the German government's announced strategy to reduce risks of becoming too dependent on China.
China and Germany are the second and third largest economies in the world. The significance of consolidating and developing Sino-German relations transcends the scope of bilateral relations. It has an important impact on the Eurasian continent and even the entire world.
China is Germany's #1 trading partner. Giant German firms such as Volkswagen have been actively expanding their business there for dozens of years. But many other companies have said they feel disadvantaged or even discriminated against, accusing China of protecting its own companies with massive subsidies.
This is a key issue all over the world. Many countries do that, especially when it comes to renewable energies and advanced electromobility technologies. And that's why it's important that we establish processes here that ensure that we move away from the practice where everyone acts simply according to their own ideas.
That's one of the reasons the EU has launched several investigations into cheaper Chinese goods flooding the market, including electric vehicles. German car makers fear these investigations could lead to a damaging trade war.
The primary goal of a business must be to make profits. The Chinese market contributes 2/3 of global electric vehicle sales, so the Chinese market is indispensable to German car companies, and they also build factories there.
Germany's Chinese partners see Scholz's visit as a positive sign.
I think the message is very clear. Germany wants to continue cooperation with China, continue to grow business in China, continue to expand some of the areas currently maybe not enough cooperation or not enough German business presence in China, such as agriculture field.
Over the years, China relied on Germany and the EU for tech imports, but now it's technologically self-sufficient. In the event of a major spat with the world's second largest economy, Germany's could be seriously damaged. Some experts say German GDP could shrink by 5%, the same amount as during the COVID crisis. Dmitry Medvedenko, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, for more on this, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Milan, Italy, is Daniel Gross. He's the director of the Institute for European Policy Making at Bocconi University and an advisor to the European Parliament. And from Singapore is Shay Gong. She's an assistant professor in the China program at Nanyang Technological University. A very warm welcome to both of you. Mr. Gross, I'll start with you in Milan. Why has Olaf Scholz gone from pledging to scale back Germany's reliance on China when he took office to, what he was saying when he was in China, calling for equal access to China's markets for foreign firms?
I think Olaf Scholz wanted to see reality. And the reality is that German firms do good business in China. They complain because they might be doing even better business. but the Chinese market is very important to them, both as a production venue, but also because some Chinese competitors are now appearing in Europe. The political Berlin has perhaps a different opinion. The political Berlin would like China to play a less important role for the German economy, but reality is different. China is just one of the biggest markets in the world, and German companies cannot avoid being there. And I think that's the reality he finds, and that's the reality he has to accept.
Okay. Ms. Gong, do you agree with Mr. Gross that essentially the economic relationship between the world's second and third largest economy will trump political calculations here?
Well, we have to be aware that definitely, economic and business interests, is driving Scholz visit China because as, the leader, he wants to see what is really happening, right? Because Beijing is trying to, play its charm offensive through some level of market reforms, like reduce negative lists for FDIs that may be really beneficial for the German companies or even for the European companies. But we need to understand the context of China-Europe relations of today. One thing in particular is about the growing competition. It's a consensus among all the EU members. And the visit actually came after the launch of the EU de-risking strategy to reduce the economic dependence on China, right? And we've heard so many stories and complaints about the unfair practice that the Chinese market, or the Chinese government has been intervening in its market, right, through the subsidies, and also through the favorable fiscal and financial, support. But the second point I want to highlight is actually is the structural differences in handling with Russia, where I think during the visit, the Chancellor actually pointed out that Germany is very concerned about China's engagement with Russia, and some of the engagement can actually provide advantage to Russia in terms of the dual usage of the assistance that China provided, right? But also China condemned the EU sanctions on Russia, which also affected Chinese companies. And one last point I want to highlight, that I don't really think fundamental things will change because the two sides have really fundamental ideological divide on how to build an international liberal order. So these differences will continue to decisively constrain achievements and breakthroughs in the bilateral relationship.
Okay, there's lots to pick up on there. I want to go back to Daniel Gross with the first thing that you talked about, which is the context that this visit is taking place. Something we've already mentioned, the European Union is investigating China, for what it calls its overcapacity, its dumping practices. Mr. Gross, where does the German Chancellor stand on this? Does he support the European the investigations or not?
I think there's some difference of opinion among European countries on what the Commission is doing right now, because German automobile producers are doing very important business in China. And German automobile producers also do not feel threatened by Chinese imports. And therefore, many people in Europe think that this investigation of the Commission was more to protect French interests than German interests. But Germany is, of course, an important country in Europe and the European Union, but it cannot always dictate what's being done. And I think that is the difference also between the political level and the commercial level. Okay. At the political level, many in Europe would like to reduce our reliance on China. The economic reality is different. And I think this tension between the politics and the economics is the background to this visit, and this tension will continue for a long time.
Okay. And as you mentioned, Mr. Gross, we had the CEO of Mercedes, of BMW, just to name a few, talking about how they don't see competition from China. They see opportunities in China. Ms. Gong, which fields do you see it growing in? And how important is that to China, to show that it can do really good business and trade with a European country in the backdrop of these tensions with the European Union?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the key areas that both sides will be really, happy to work on is the green energy, right? One reason is definitely because of Russia, where Europe is suffering from this energy crisis throughout the years. And second is that China is gaining advantages and also can, somehow can, complement with the capability building in Europe. And third thing is that I think the two sides, they can actually, think about the third-party collaboration, which Germany used to be part of it in the Belt and Road Initiative. It doesn't have to be brand in the Belt and Road Initiative, but they can they can think out or carve out some plans in the third market, like let's say Southeast Asia, let's say, Indonesia, where China can capitalize on Germany's technology and also the good image in terms of building the green technology.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up third markets, because I want to bring Daniel Gross in here on a fascinating article that you wrote about trade restrictions and about how, trade restrictions such as tariffs, such as the ones that we saw Donald Trump put on China, don't actually reduce the amount of trade, they just redirect it.
That's exactly what we are observing. When the US does not allow imports of cars, for example, from China, then the European producers have a good market for themselves in the United States, and the Chinese export more to Europe. So, and we have the same thing also in Asia, where the Chinese ship their intermediate goods to Malaysia, and then Malaysia puts things together and ships smartphones, then go to the US. So these bilateral trade restrictions between the US and China, they're actually to the benefit of others, like Malaysia, like Vietnam, but also like Europe. And that's why I think Europe doesn't really have to take a stance on this particular issue. It can just be, let's say, the more reasonable partner, certainly more reasonable than the United States.
Okay, just lastly, Ms. Gong, let me put this to you. With the US election coming up later this year, how do you think China and the EU and Germany, how are they looking at their relationship in light of what might be coming out of the US later this year?
I think there are a lot of things are going, but one thing is very clear in terms of how we perceive China. Whether it's a market economy, right? That's something that China wants to be recognized throughout the years, especially from the European counterparts. But with the fundamental differences that I mentioned previously, about the ideological divide, about how to play the market role, and also about the the perceptions of Russia. I do think that the two sides will be still continue to grapple with the issues that put in front of them. But as Germany has set a very good example in terms of how to stretch out despite the constrained space, how to keep the conversation open, and how to make each other understand the concerns and try to work things out is something that I think the regional partners should have a close eye on.
Xie Gong in Singapore and Daniel Gross in Milan, Italy. Thank you both very much for your time.
Thank you.
Nigeria is Africa's largest oil producer, yet the nation's economy is in crisis. Inflation is rocketing, foreign exchange is in short supply, and corporate giants are leaving the country. 40% of Nigeria's population now lives in poverty. President Bola Tinubu, who took office last year, has moved to overhaul the economy and attract investment. But are his measures working? We'll get into that with our guest shortly, but first, let's have a look at what's been done to turn things around. When Tinubu assumed power last May, Nigeria was spending almost all of its revenues on servicing debt. The oil-rich nation had barely any money to pay for anything else. So his first measure was to scrap popular fuel subsidies that were costing the country around $10 billion a year. The president has also loosened controls over the currency in a bid to unify the official and unofficial exchange rates. As you can see here, the naira was devalued in June and in February. It had lost almost 70% of its value by March. But now the naira has been labelled the best performing currency in the world after a strong rebound in March and April. It's back below 1,200 to the dollar after the central bank increased interest rates to almost 25%, making it more attractive to keep savings in the naira. Well, these reforms have been very taxing for Nigeria's population. Inflation is at the highest level in almost 3 decades. The price of rice has doubled in the past year, while petrol price jumped threefold. And all this is putting pressure on Tinubu's government to prove the reforms will eventually end the economic pain. Let's get stuck into this with Gospel Obele. He's an economist for Streetnomics. That's a Nigerian think tank. Thank you for your time, Mr. Obele. So the Naira is rebounding, but the country is burning through the foreign exchange reserves at a rate not seen in 4 years. Can you explain the connection and if it's a concern?
Yes, first to say that there is a supply issue. That's a given because we're not generating enough foreign exchange receipts, particularly from non-oil exports, as the case may be. As a result, there is a constraint around how much of dollar supply is available in the Nigerian economy to be able to meet its consistent increase, its ever-rising, local demand for the exchange. And that's really been the challenge for a long time. And again, juggling the fact that Nigeria is not so much of a productive nation in terms of production capabilities and export capabilities to rake in more foreign exchange receipts. So that supply gap is why you also find the central bank trying to resort to its reserves to fund most of its, should I say, short-termist reforms that we've seen more recently.
Yeah, I'm glad you said you're calling them short-term reforms. If you look at, we keep saying that Nigeria is Africa's largest oil producer, yet it actually imports most of the petrol that it uses. Is the country looking at longer-term resolutions to the long-standing economic problems?
Yes, the country is, but however, I think it's a case of, number one, there's a gross underestimation of the efforts, investment, behavioral and cultural change that needs to happen, to steer the country in a more sustainable path of progress and prosperity. Also, given the fact that there is a very weak political will in context, although more recently the current administration, led by the current President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, has shown some little bit of more political will, but again, it's still not sufficient with regards to the level of change or progress or prosperity that needs to happen.
What are the behavioral and the cultural changes that you think need to happen? Nigeria has been beset with corruption, for example, for so many years.
Well, one of the major behavioral change in my own context would be leading reforms, from a ground-up approach, all right, that are very reflective at the subnational and local levels, and ensuring that reforms are a reflection of what the people need at a particular point in time, and how market forces are also reinforcing, the position of those reforms and the delivery of those policy programs. Take, for instance, the cash transfer program. Whilst it's a necessary condition to be able to sort of deliver relief points for Nigerians, we also need strategic sector landslide interventions that will sort of power key sectors in the local economy, and also encourage non-oil sector MSMEs to sort of, export. There's so many Nigerian businesses that are export ready, but they do not have the finance or access to markets, capabilities to do more within and across borders. So the cultural and behavioral change is largely around institutional support and interventions to a large extent.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so how do you enable that, that financial support, that investment, and what role does foreign investment have to play? I mean, foreign capital has really fled Nigeria in the past few months.
Yes, it's quite disheartening, and this is largely linked to the poor, business environment to a large extent. We've seen many other African nations, who are much more attractive for foreign investment, as the case may be. So we need to, first and foremost, for Nigeria, need to face our structural challenges, all right, the structural issues around power infrastructure, particularly security, and all that, and also the ease of doing business, contracts, regulations, bottlenecks, and all of these things, and even the business environment itself. All right, so that needs to be fixed. Once that is fixed, with a very strong coordinative support of the Naira, of the currency, between the fiscal and the monetary bit, it's going to be a lot more easier for us to sort of, find a pathway towards prosperity and regulations that actually strengthen the local currency for local businesses.
Okay, and what about the local people? Do you see that the changes that have been made will in fact benefit Nigerians themselves?
I don't think the changes will really benefit Nigerians in the short term, and that's because there was a deepening cost of living crisis, and the average Nigerian is getting poorer and poorer. Consumer classes are constantly shrinking, and we've also seen a case where prices of goods and services are not necessarily coming down. Even if we succeed at inflation, the cost of living crisis has eaten very deep into the core production and consumption elements right now locally in Nigeria, right? So what we now need is rethinking the sectoral interventions that must happen in the different blocks of sectors that have the capacity to lift the Nigerian people from just poverty or mid-level poverty, to more sustainable paths when it comes to prosperity, as the case may be. So for me, it's more around driving sectoral landslide interventions that can unlock prosperity at the pace and at the scale at which Nigerians need it the most to not just survive, but also grow and thrive in the midst of the evolving cost of living crisis and uncertainties.
And of course, that has an impact on Africa, doesn't it, given Nigeria is the most populous country, largest economy?
Yes, it does have an impact on Africa. To a very large extent for me will be that we need to evolve in our negotiations and conversation in terms of value add and what value we bring to the table. Most of the challenges we find in Nigeria are very consistent in many other African countries. The quality of leadership, quality of reform, security, cultural change, institutional behavior, and all of the likes. So until there is a structural and institutional reform, we may not be able to bring about the necessary growth and development Africa needs, particularly in channeling those growth and development to be owned and powered by Africans in context of the prosperity that the region really needs to be able to unlock newer levels of sustainable development.
Gospel Obele of the Nigerian think tank Streetnomics, thank you so much for your insights on this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
By 2030, the world will see its first trillionaire, while more than 500 million people will remain poor. Eradicating poverty is one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, to be met by that year. With just 6 years to go, many nations are off track to achieving the SDGs. The President of the UN General Assembly has launched the first Sustainability Week. Gabriel Elizondo has spoken to Dennis Francis at the high-level discussions last week. He started by asking him, what's the importance of the initiative?
The Sustainable Development Agenda on which we embarked, we being the United Nations, in 2015, has not matured with the expectation that we had. Progress to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, for a number of reasons, beyond the control of any individual country, has slowed considerably, and so the goals are in fact off track. So we needed to stop for a moment, take stock of what's happening, and refocus and re-engineer our efforts so as to bring things back on track, because we are midway through to the Sustainable Development timeframe, which is 2030.
Let's talk about a few of the themes that have been discussed this week. And a number really struck me. It was $225 trillion in global public debt.
Yes.
There's a debt crisis, you've said. How is this sustainable for the world to maintain so much debt?
Well, let's understand what that $225 trillion represents. That represents the current stock of global debt. That is all the countries in the world. The debt that is owed by developing countries would be a proportion of that debt. Now, I don't have that number in my head, but I can say to you, without fear of contradiction, that for developing countries, countries in the global south, that number is also a huge number. And the thing with the debt is that it has to be repaid. What has happened in the case of the global south is that there is an extraordinary overhang of debt. And so countries, developing countries, and in particular, countries in special situations, the most vulnerable ones, the landlocked countries, the least developed countries, and the small island developing states, are forced to make choices between repaying the interest on the debt. The interest, not the principal.
Just the interest.
The interest on the debt. They have to choose between paying the interest or using that money instead to finance sustainable development, to pay for schools, to pay for medical facilities, health centers, etc. It's a very difficult choice. So what needs to happen, what the UN has been advocating, and others, is that there needs to be a reform of the international financial architecture to usher in a new period which will allow countries in desperate circumstances, particularly the most vulnerable ones, to be able to borrow on less burdensome terms. That means at more affordable rates of interest, because as it stands at the moment, many developing countries are forced to borrow at 3 and 4 times the rates of interest that the average developed country borrows at.
And at the end of this week, what is the call for action?
Choose sustainability. Choose sustainability. Because in choosing sustainability, you will actually be making a plug for the longevity of our species on this planet. It's the natural environment that creates the assets that we use to live on this planet successfully. And we have been successful, but not without creating unnecessary damage. And now the science has taught us that we do not have to create damage. We can live sustainably. We can use resources through our consumption patterns more sensibly, smarter, in order to minimize our footprint on the planet.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us on X, formerly known as Twitter. I'm at Liz Puranam. And do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page where there are individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. And that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Elizabeth Puranam from the whole team. Thank you for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.